Okay, so I think we can start now. Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Yirga Gelawaldias. I am joining this conversation, this dialogue from the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation in Burulu, Pars. And I want to pay my respects to the indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that the sovereignty of the people, the indigenous people over their land, has never been ceded. Thank you everyone for joining us to this wonderful webinar from the Development Studies Association of Australia. This association is a very important body that facilitates critical dialogue on development studies and its implication into so many fields. It's a very important dialogue that we are having today. And I am the director of the Center for Human Rights Education here at Curtin University, and I'm also the vice president of the DSAA. I'm very pleased, I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague, an excellent scholar, Deborah Cummins, from also working with DSAA in many ways. Deb is a founder and executive director of Bridging Peoples and Industry Representatives on Executive Committee of DSAA, Development Studies Association of Australia. She holds a PhD in Postcolonial Local Governance from the University of New South Wales, and degree of law honors and arts honors from the University of Melbourne. Deb is a specialist in community engagement and locally led development in complex post-colonial environments. She has worked with multilateral agencies and NGOs since 2005 and publishes widely on governance, political economy, and civil engagement. Deb's a specialist in community engagement and ground-up research and development in complex post-colonial environments. She has worked since 2005 as a technical specialist, as a researcher, as a trader across multilateral agencies and international and local NGOs. Her work focuses on local governance, political economy, civic engagement, women's political participation, access to justice, and community development, bringing together legal expertise and community-based approaches to support inclusive and effective governance networks. Today, in this important presentation, she will share with us her experience, her knowledge, and also her theory, which is really important in helping us understand the world we're living in. We will hear from Deb for the first 30 to 40 minutes. And then we will take questions from the audience. Given we seem to be, there seems to be quite a few people around, we'll try to let you ask questions directly if possible, but if that becomes unmanageable, we may ask you to write your questions instead. So what I encourage you to do is, while Deb is presenting, I encourage you to write your questions on the chat, and we will try to read the questions later on. So now let's go to the presentation, and Deb, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yirga, for such a generous introduction. As Yirga said, I am the founder and director of Bridging Peoples, but I'm in this presentation. Normally I talk about quite practical things, and there will be practical things in this conversation. But I'm getting in my time machine. I'm going back to when I did my original PhD fieldwork too many years ago to name. So I'm going to get straight into the presentation. Bear with me. This is coming through okay?
Yes.
Great. So the title of this webinar is Rethinking Postcolonial Governance. And this is an area of work really which I've been working in for the past 20 years, even before I did my PhD. So I'll be drawing on quite a few different experiences, as well as presenting some theory that I developed, building on already existing theory that I later published in my PhD and then in my book. So what we're going to talk about today is first, have a bit of a discussion about why laws, policies, programs fail locally, particularly in post-colonial environments, which, as I'm sure we all know, is the majority of the world. Then I'm going to link that discussion with some thoughts around legal and institutional theory, because as Jürgen mentioned, I actually started my career as a lawyer, not as an anthropologist or a sociologist, which is what many people think. And so I often, I like to take the opportunity to be able to draw these anthropological or these deeper contextual lessons to, well, what does this mean for us? So I will be drawing the theory that I'll be presenting to together with legal and institutional theory, and talking about what it misses, which is really important. I'll then be talking a little bit about the realities of hybrid post-colonial governance settings, and finally share a few thoughts going forward. So please, as Jürgen mentioned, feel free to put your questions in chat at any time, and at the end of the presentation, we'll make sure that there's plenty of time to get into it. So why do laws or policies or programs fail? Very often we think about laws, policies, programs in a development setting, but really in any state setting is a pretty top-down sort of thing. You've got programs that or policies that are developed by governments, by social enterprises, by NGOs, by international organizations such as the UN or the World Bank, and they focus on developing a program, often based on a little bit of research and needs assessment or something along those lines, and then developing an already packaged set of institutions and a set of programs or policies or institutions that they then apply to local communities. And the presumption is that somehow by magic, by putting these things on paper, it then it translates into change on the ground. But we know that this isn't how things actually work. If we look at how local communities themselves function, they have a whole bunch of things that they're already navigating, things that already exist within the local context, that sometimes these new policies or laws or programs take into account. Sometimes they don't, but regardless, they often don't. These reforms or interventions, I guess, that are introduced from the outside often don't mesh well with local realities that include this bunch of different things, such as, different gender norms, which may be informed by different cultures, the ways in which village councils work, the way in which customary governance works, the way in which customary law works, the way in which religious leadership works, the way in which subsistence economy works, and how that looks quite different to capitalist economy. Very often these interventions from outside don't hit the ground well, and they don't reflect these realities. And we have a development problem worldwide. We can see, and I can certainly say, reflecting on my own experience, not only in Timor-Leste, but also when I was working with First Nations in Australia, we can see that the state engages quite poorly with post-colonial communities. This is simply a reality. I mean, it depends on the situation, it depends on the state, it depends on the particular intervention, but as a general statement, when it's post-colonial, when it's complex, the state doesn't know how to deal well. And I would expand that to say it's not only the state, but many external actors don't know how to engage well with post-colonial communities. And the root cause, most of the time, is not lack of money. And this is why I talk about the development problem. Very often, I find, having worked in the international development sector, the global development sector, very often there's a presumption that, oh, you know, the problem is lack of money, lack of resources, because we're talking about developing countries that, you know, don't have the same level of you know, financial capital at their disposal, etc. But I can definitely confirm that a lot of the problems that we're talking about when we're talking about post-colonial local engagement also applies to Aboriginal First Nations communities in Australia, which is where I started my professional career. And Australia has money. The reality is that the Australian government has not, even with that money at their disposal, has not been able to engage well. So we can say from that, drawing on that, and Australia isn't the only country that doesn't deal well with their First Nations communities. So we can say, drawing from that, that the root cause isn't a lack of money or resources. I have found over the years as well, and also within the literature, but certainly within development practice, it's quite common to fall into some pretty unhelpful binaries. So there's very often when we're talking about post-colonial governance, post-colonial communities, people will start immediately falling into the binary of, you know, you have the modern system of governance, which is represented by the state, and the traditional systems of governance that are represented by via customary governance. And it fails to engage with the reality that communities are living, and it also fails to recognise the very real dynamic contemporary relevance of customary governance in communities today. It's like kind of putting them into a in a museum where, and that's not helpful to any of us, and certainly not to people who live in this dynamic. What we also know is that people worldwide are crossing daily between systems. So how is it that they're able to cross daily between these different systems, but external actors, us, because we're the common denominator here, the state, we're not able to do so as well? What do we have to learn? Some of it comes back to some pretty mainstream policy assumptions, legal assumptions as well. It's commonly presumed that if you develop a law or a policy or a program, and then you put a set of resources around it. So imagine it's something to do with the courts and with police, and then, you know, you would adequately fund the police in a particular program, and that is going to magically result in changes, predictable changes in people's lives. But people aren't, you know, a mechanical problem to be solved. They will also, when external ideas, when external resources enter into a community, community members themselves engage politically. They engage with the resources that come in. They engage with these different interventions that come in. And they engage sometimes in a manner which is unpredictable from the perspective of external actors. They exercise their own agency. And through so doing, they actively change the way in which these external interventions are absorbed into communities. What they do when they engage with these resources, when they exercise their own agency, what they do is that they make it make sense locally. And sometimes that means that it doesn't make sense to external actors. The original people who developed this law or this policy or this program. So this has been my career, looking into this. As I mentioned, I started my career as a lawyer. I studied law, and my first real professional job was not as a lawyer. It was actually working for an NGO called Reconciliation Australia, where I worked in their Indigenous community governance research project. And that was when my eyes were opened to the realities of coexisting systems of governance. And I remember at the time, I was very young. I remember at the time feeling incredibly stupid, probably for the first 6 months of the job, feeling incredibly stupid because I was trying to go between First Nations leaders who were telling me how things were working in their communities. I'd be sitting down with them going, yeah, that makes so much sense. I would try to bring it back to Canberra, never managed to be able to translate what they were telling me into the ways in which policymakers were engaging with their own, with their work and with their programming around governance, including governance for First Nations communities. During that job, I wouldn't say that I did an especially good job at that job, but I learned a hell of a lot. And during that time, I got intensely curious about post-colonial governance and what it means when you have coexisting systems of governance, because I mentioned that 6 months, the first 6 months I just spent feeling dumb until suddenly I realized, oh, they're actually using the word governance in a very different way. And then I started getting curious. And I started getting curious enough to decide to do my PhD. And I did my PhD in my PhD fieldwork in the mountains of Timor-Leste. This is a photo of me going back to school together with the leader of a local NGO and a couple of the teachers and school children who now would themselves be adults. I decided it was time I needed to go back to school, not in the literal sense of going back to university, but rethinking, really going back to school, because I needed to better understand how things work at the local level. Because my thinking was, if I could understand, because we know that community members themselves successfully move between these systems of governance on a daily basis. The problem is that external actors don't necessarily know how to engage with that reality. So my thinking was, if you go to the source, if you go to where community members are managing to do it, figure out what's going on there, then slowly, bit by bit, you can draw things back up to those spaces where laws and policies and programs are being developed in order to make them more nuanced. And that is ultimately what has become my career and what we focus on in Bridging Peoples. When I talk about the need to rethink post-colonial governance, it comes with the very first point that needs to be made is that there is essentially a normative failure. So there is a failure among many external actors that put together these various interventions because they feel that there is a presumption that if they write things on paper and then resource it, that communities' lives will magically change, that magic will happen. We know that's not the case. The second underlying normative failure within this is that in a post-colonial setting, there's this idea that you can choose between your preferred system. I remember at the time when I was doing my PhD, and this was very early on in Timor-Leste's independence, people were only just getting their heads around, what is this democracy thing? What does independence mean for us? What does this mean for us as communities, who have always lived according to our deep-rooted systems of law and systems of governance, customary governance? And what was happening in terms of how people were engaging from Dili and from outside of Dili, from Washington, from Geneva, from Canberra, the presumption was that, customary governance must be bad. It's in the way. It's in the way of progress. It's in the way of democracy. And so they just ignore it. And I would have these discussions with people sometimes where they'd say, what? You're studying customary governance as well. You mustn't like women's rights very much, which I found bizarre. But when you think of it from their perspective, their idea that, you choose your preferred system and then you go for that. I can kind of see, I will never agree, but I can kind of understand the logic of where they were coming from. It was a very frustrating set of conversations that still happen. When we're talking about governance, just to help frame this discussion, when we're talking about governance, we're not talking about And that's key to understanding what I'm talking about today. There's some of the ideas that I'm presenting to you today. Government is the set of, institutions that have been created in order to provide and to implement laws and policies and engage with other state government bodies, etc., etc. Governance is how the concept or the set of concepts, in fact, because there are many different theories of governance, but governance talks about both the set of formal and informal rules, systems, and norms that govern people's behaviour. So it doesn't have to be the formal state-based system. It can be many different systems. It's about broadening our lens and what we're looking at in order to see the broader contextual environment for what it is before we go straight to the normative question of, oh, this is how it should be for people. Another important point to remember when we're talking about post-colonial governance and the realities of communities where there are coexisting state-based and customary systems of governance that operate in a dynamic format to this day across the world, every system of governance carries its own epistemology and worldview. And what that means, if I go back to those days in very early on during state formation in Timor-Leste, also in how the Australian government engages with First Nations communities, when external interventions simply carried out in a normative way, simply saying this is how things should be. We're going to, put together this program, this package, and then present it to communities because we know how things should be. There's a lot of cultural baggage which is built into that, and it comes from a very different epistemology. Communities already, those that are operating according to customary systems of governance, as well as state-based systems of governance, they're operating according to their cultural worldview as well, the epistemological way of thinking that their customary governance is built on. And that's important to understand. So when we bring together some of these ideas, the challenge is to move away from that, from the simple normative idea of, oh, we can put something together down on paper, throw a bunch of resources at it, throw it into communities, predictable change will happen. We know that that's not the case. So it's to move away from this idea of, simply developing institutions and then financing them, to instead look in a much more nuanced way at the process of institutionalization. And that's where my theory went when I was attempting to make sense of what I was experiencing and learning about in the mountains of Timor-Leste. So a scholar, he was actually working in international relations, came up with what I found to be a really useful theory, talking about how institutions become institutionalized. So how they actually begin to stick among those people, for him, states, that the institutions, the laws, the policies, the programs, the ideas behind them, how that actually creates change in how people, groups of people, states relate to each other. And his theory is pretty simple. You've got the development of institutions. You've got institutions, which, as I mentioned, can be formal or informal. In this case, we're talking about formal institutions. You've got material capabilities. So here we're talking about resources. Institutions will only work if you write a law. It's not going to do anything if it only stays on paper. You also need to finance it. You also need to put other resources behind it. You need to have the material capability to back up the institution. And there's also, you need to be able to engage with existing ideas. And as you're attempting, because institutions are often developed in order to move people's ideas, the way in which they see the world. And so what we see here is not a top-down approach, even though I've put institutions at the top, it's actually putting institutions at the same level as material capabilities and ideas. So they're in a constant dynamic flux. They are ideas, existing ideas will also influence how institutions become institutionalized, how they become strong, how they become effective, how they become interpreted, sometimes, as I said, in very unpredictable ways. Same thing with material capabilities. They also impact on and shape how institutions are absorbed, how institutions are changed, how institutions also might change the realm of ideas, how they might contribute to people's ideas of, for example, democracy or human rights. So this is the framework that I developed back in the day. So we have Cox's framework. We have institutions, we have material capabilities, and we have ideas. But within a post-colonial setting, that isn't enough, because we also have customary institutions. And customary institutions as well. And imagine this, we're talking about sometimes quite small communities, but people are operating in this really complex environment, particularly local leaders. So customary institutions are also shaping and impacting on how resources are being shared, material capabilities, how resources are being deployed in different areas of community life. Customary institutions are also impacting on people's ideas around legitimacy, etc. And based on that interaction, community members will engage with state-based institutions as well, in the same way that sometimes state-based institutions will, through this dynamic of engaging with, in this constant flux, engaging with the distribution of resources and the shaping of ideas, may also influence how the balancing act is found between coexisting customary and state-based systems, customary and state-based institutions. So this is what I call the cultural intelligence framework. So what does this mean? How is this coexistence navigated? It's all very well to have a theory which, looks kind of cool on paper, but how do we actually use this to understand what's working on the ground when we introduce programs or policies or laws? The first thing to remember is that most of the time, if we go back, actually, I'm going to go back to this framework. You see here that there is no arrow directly between state-based institutions and customary institutions. That's deliberate. Because if state-based institutions tries to formalize customary institutions into laws, it automatically changes it. So it's no longer that sort of within that full customary realm. Instead, what we're seeing here is the constant dynamic between how people are living their lives in terms of resources, in terms of ideas, and how that then shapes the institutionalization of both customary institutions and state-based institutions, how they work together, how they change together. Most of the work in doing that balancing act goes back to local leaders. They navigate these systems. They navigate these systems when they're working well together. And there are many, many instances in community life where they do work well together. They also navigate those systems during those points of tension, because there are commonly points of tension between the normative systems or the values, the normative values that are being, or the epistemology, the worldview that is being presented or smuggled in via state-based laws or state-based governance, as well as the cultural values that are being expressed via customary governance. There are most definitely points of tension there. The way in which it works on the ground, the best way of being able to understand a lot of how that balancing act works is to actually go back to the local leadership. And that can include your customary leaders, it can include local police officers, it can include sub-district administrators, it can include elected village chiefs or elected women's representatives. Anyone who is occupying a position of leadership often also exercises that leadership in helping people to understand and find a way to balance those competing systems. So if you imagine a dispute that comes up locally, decisions need to be made around, will this be resolved by taking it to the courts, going to the police? Will it be resolved locally by customary elders? Those are the types of things that local leaders play a central, pivotal role on a daily basis in navigating. And this is not to romanticize. There's a shadow side to this. Local leaders, most of them, all of us, you know, people are people. You've got terrible leaders at every level. You've got fantastic leaders at every level. But imagine local leaders that are trying to navigate these systems in tension and trying to do this as well as they possibly can with the benefit of the community in their heart. Even with those people, there's a shadow side to it because they're operating according to what's normal within that community. So that naturally, the way in which it works when this balancing act is left only to local leaders without real nuanced, sensitive engagement from those who are attempting to engage from outside as well. The shadow side to it is that it naturally reproduces existing inequalities. So when there's a balancing act and marginalised groups typically get left out of the picture, they're going to be that set of voices is going to be the first set of voices that gets lost as people are trying to find answers to hard questions. Very often, I have found that in those situations, it's really common to blame the communities or the customary systems, but that's really not a fair characterization of what's been happening because the reason that the local leaders are navigating those systems is because the state relies on it. They do. If I reflect in the reality in Timor, for example, if the state didn't rely on local customary dispute resolution or local dispute resolution that's carried out through a combination of customary and state-based in village councils, the already overwhelmed court system and police system would break. They would not be able to deal with the sheer number. And they certainly wouldn't be able to have the capacity to engage with people who are dealing with some complex cultural questions as well. So this is not something that when we see the shadow side of the reproduction of existing inequalities, this is not because of customary systems. It's because also of our lack of capacity in engaging in that environment. So I wanted to give a few different examples to bring this to life, a few different examples of what this navigating coexisting systems can look like. So one, as I mentioned, I arrived in Timor very early on in the days of independence and people were getting their head around democracy. It was very often in the process of democratization. It was talked about all the time. And it was very, very common for people to think, it was common for people who were doing work around local elections, etc., to talk about customary systems as though they were in the way. What I found in the villages themselves, in how people navigated things, it was much more nuanced than that. So, for example, I'm thinking of a very, very traditional suko in which the lirai, the traditional king, has always been the ruler of this suko, and that then got translated into the elected position of the village chief. People, when the local elections came around, everyone continued to vote for the village chief. Is that undemocratic? Not really, because they're voting. this simply drawing on their own set of values. And so people are finding ways to navigate competing systems. And perhaps over time, I've certainly seen these changes in various villages. Perhaps over time, people will begin to bring in new values as well as they're assessing the different candidates that are standing for election. But simply saying, oh, well, the Lira is being voted in as the village chief, that means that democracy is not working. No, that's a really thin and not particularly useful way of categorizing, of characterizing that situation. Another is around environmental management. I know there's a couple of people in this webinar who work in the area of carbon sequestration via tree planting. A lot of the success of that type of work is because people already have their customary systems around not ownership of land, stewardship of land. And that idea of stewardship of land comes from the customary systems, which are deep and important. So this, these initiatives around environmental management, around and bringing in new ideas. I mean, the global carbon economy is very new, but they are tapping into and working to reflect existing realities in communities, because it's the best way to get things done. It's effective. It's already legitimate from community perspectives. Another area which is commonly talked about is gender. The idea that you have to bring in gender norms from outside, which reflect, very individualistic ways of and often capitalist ways of creating change in women's lives. Communities themselves are working through different ways of being able to raise women's voices within their context, so that they can, on their own terms, create change. And this is where we see post-colonial feminist theory really coming to the fore, because they're providing space to women themselves to exercise their own agency. And those women are engaging with and part of and value the customary systems that they're part of, as well as some of the new ideas that are coming in from outside. So what does this mean for us? First, I spoke about the normative failure of a lot of mainstream development, whether it's legal development, policy development, development of different programs where things are written on paper, resourced, thrown into communities. I spoke about that as a normative failure because the missing piece is the question around institutionalization. How does that then get absorbed into people's lives? How do people themselves negotiate and absorb those external influences into their already rich set of governance structures that they live by? The post-colonial governance process, which involves a rich mix of old and new, internal and external, is a constant process of constant negotiation. As I mentioned as well, sometimes it can have its shadow side, but that is not because of customary governance. It's because of a failure to navigate that balance effectively and in a nuanced manner that works with the governance environment as the operating environment and starts from there. We often fail to get that. It also means I've focused in this short presentation around what we miss. If I'm in Dili or I'm in Canberra and I want to begin implementing something that's intended to touch community lives. One thing is, yes, if I fail to engage with community realities, and I fail to recognise the governance environment as it is now, I'm deliberately tying one hand behind my back because I'm ignoring a really significant part of community life, and I'm probably not going to I'm not going to do well at my job. That's one part of it, just simply the failure to get things done. But the other part of it as well is that top-down development can do really significant harm. If we look at the problems that the world's facing now, You know, a lot of it, like our planet's dying. We're consumed with individualist, capitalist ways of thinking that is causing significant harm. If we continue to promote those ways of thinking only because we think that that's better than how communities have been governing themselves for millennia, we can do significant harm not only to those communities but also to ourselves, because we're failing to learn. If we want to understand how change happens at community level, so getting to the practicality of tracking change, engaging in a more nuanced way, it requires recognition of all worldviews. You don't get to cherry pick. You don't get to say, I like that bit, but I don't like that bit. And so I'm only going to focus on this bit, ignore that bit, say it shouldn't exist. And then, you know, everything will be fine. It's not, because it is also part of the governance environment. You have no choice. You want to do your job well, you take into account everything within that community. That is your first point of call. And then after that, you can begin working with and sharing power with community members themselves who know what they need and know their realities much better than you or I or other people who are attempting to support them from outside of the community. Finally, I guess a call, this is just me from my heart as much as anything else, is we need more humility. Going back to the fact that top-down development can do harm not only to communities, but also harm to our potential paths for all of us. We need to step down from our pedestal and ask, what do we have to learn? What do we have to learn from these different ways of seeing the world and of engaging with the world and of engaging with each other and of engaging with the environment? I think that that is something that all of us can benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very rich, wonderful, inspiring, and insightful presentation. We really appreciate how it was presented, the slides, and also the timing. Thank you. Now, I want to invite participants to raise their hands if they want to ask any question. This is time for Q&A. If you want to ask anything, please unmute yourself and you can ask a question or your question. Yeah. Any question? Maybe until participants think of their question and ask, if I just may ask Deb, I think this is a very interesting way of looking at how we should rethink negotiating in multiple cultural contexts when we think of working with communities like Timor-Leste, and it resonates well with some of my ideas when I think of work in different places where I go. The places where I go to, there's always complexity. There's always layers and layers of truths that emerge at every stage of my work. So one of the questions that I have is if you can share with us some of the ways in which you engage yourself with communities and practice your theory. And you have mentioned some of them, but if there are some examples that may be of use for especially students, researchers who would go out to different cultural contexts, all they have are usually theories and stories that they might have read and formulated some kind of meaning in their mind, but that is not supported by their experience. So how does the lived experience, the actual connection, the conversation, the participating in different cultural practices and rituals and so on, how does that lived experience actually become part of your understanding? To what extent do we come to know places where we go to? So if you can draw from your experience and some of your encounters and examples, I think that would be useful.
Thank you so much, Yoga. And you've gone straight to the crux of it in terms of the research side of things. I think because I focused more on implications for policy makers, etc. And it's a really important set of questions for researchers themselves. So I think the key to being able to understand local realities as well as you can is to drop the theory at the beginning. Just drop it. In my PhD and the research that we do in Bridging Peoples as well, I talk about ground up research because it's an easier way of being able to explain what we do, but it's based on a theoretical approach which has existed for quite some time called grounded theory. And this is something that I teach my set of volunteers, my researchers here, and this is the type of work that we do. So grounded theory operates first, you go to community, you speak to the people who are affected and the people around them. You speak to stakeholders and you speak to them about the broad question. If it's about women's rights, you say, like, I would sit down with women in that community as well as village chiefs, as well as various others, and say, well, what do you think is already working well in your community around this, and where might things change, and how have things changed before, and et cetera, without bringing in my own theory yet of how I think gender relations should be in that community. So, and grounded theory operates through 3 levels of coding. So the first, the field work, the way in which we tend to approach it is very, very open. You have a conversation, you have a set of conversations with many different people. There's a lot of field observation as well. And a lot of it's storytelling, because that's how people engage with each other. And you ask people to tell their stories, you tell your stories. And then going through the transcripts, the results, you can begin to code them. And the coding is very simple. It will be very sort of simple stuff like, this is about agriculture, this is about women, this is about customary law, this is about whatever. You don't try to get too smart. That's the key. You don't try to be too smart. And then you categorize those open codes, and then you begin to cluster them. And that's when you can begin to see meaning. You begin to sense make. And that sense making comes from what you found in communities. It doesn't come from something you read in a book. I love books. I love reading books. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. But start with, if you're talking about wanting to understand people's lives, the first thing you do is you go to the people and you ask them about their lives. And then the next step around sense making, you can do it yourself. We often do it together with the team, including fieldwork team, who are typically just ignored and said, okay, you've done your fieldwork, leave it to the smart people now. That's never made sense to me. You bring them in, you say, okay, well, what did you find as well? What what works for you? And so that brings in a level of sort of local understanding and contextualization, but even better, if you can do it. We work in an imperfect world. I work in an imperfect world, but I give it a good shot. I try to, wherever I can, actually bring people in themselves, because this process does not require high levels of literacy or anything like that. People know how to make sense of their lives. And so that then becomes a combined sense-making where you're sharing analytical power, if you like, or you're giving the stage to the people themselves to talk about their lives from their perspective. So there you're going to learn a lot already. But it also becomes an exercise in quiet advocacy, because these people who often aren't listened to suddenly get listened to. And that then becomes the framing for the conversation. And through that system of open coding, that's a bit geeky, you've got to spend time on it. And then the axial coding, and then the selective coding, you could bring it all together. And the more you get voices which are typically not included, but are much more important than your or mine or, someone else's voice, in that sense-making process, the better the outcome will be. Yoga, you're on mute.
Brilliant. That was very good, very wonderful insights, really, for people who want to do research. Often it's really important for me to also remember that, it's all about trying to understand people the way they want to be understood.
That's right.
And in that process of doing the whole exercise is like, how do I become a good student of communities, local people, not just a researcher who tries to change their lives, but a person who tries to become their good student and try to understand them. And what you said about humility is very important. Is there any question from the audience?
There was one hand up, I see.
Okay. I don't see anyone, but please, if someone is trying to ask, please go on.
Go ahead and unmute.
Yes, I think it's from the group. Can you unmute yourself? I don't know if I can unmute you now.
The system needs to unmute. If it's too difficult, you can also write it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, maybe you can write it if you cannot unmute yourself. Is there anyone else from the remaining members of the audience? I unmuted them. Okay. Doesn't look like they are unmuted though.
I think because it's an integrated system.
Okay. Yeah, try to send us by message if you can.
Perfect.
Okay.
Here you are.
Hi, Deborah. It's me, Swastika from Expand. So the whole team is here.
Can you see us?
Can you see us?
We can.
No. You can. Oh, okay. That's good. Okay, just had a question from, I think, the area that we work on, and also from as a PhD student from my research perspective as well. One thing that you mentioned in your presentation was that all systems have their own epistemology, right? The way they view things. And the area that we work on in development, in climate adaptation and mitigation, like sometimes states try and implement things, right, when it comes to development. And sometimes, not always those changes are bad, right? Like you said, some changes are good as well, even though we try and force some things, but some changes are good. And then the idea that you mentioned in terms of collecting stories and everything and trying to understand the perspective on a grassroots level, right? And understanding the communities. Just want to hear from you, based on your experience, if a state is trying to implement something, definitely trying to work with the community, and places like Timor-Leste, post-colonial, has a lot of history. What are some ways or a way you could explain that a state can actually build trust like sometimes it's very hard, right? Like even though you're trying to do something good and the communities are working with you, but the trust factor is a bit hard to establish, right? Even though we know what their stories are and they know what we're trying to do. Just want to hear from you on how we can build trust, on how we can better communicate. Yeah.
That's such a great question. Thank you, Kirsty. And thank you. Absolutely. Not all changes that are being promoted are quote unquote bad. Not at all. You know, very often we have a shared objective that I also would be quite passionate about promoting. But the question is how, as you rightly pointed out. And absolutely, one of the key questions is around community trust in the state or in any external actors, and that needs to be built one brick at a time. I would go back to those really basic foundational human things. First, of humility. How does one person build trust with another human? How do you make friends? You approach them as an equal, right? You don't sort of take the approach of coming right in and saying, well, you know, this is how I think that you should be changing, etc., because you're entering their community. So imagine you're making friends, but you're making friends in their home. You don't say to them, okay, well, you know, I think that your kitchen should be in a different place. How about you do that? You know, the trust factor is going to go right down. And I think I want to inject a word of a bit of realism in this as well. When you go into communities, this is the reality, and it's unfortunate. When you go into communities, you're not going into well, it's not unfortunate that you're not going into a blank slate. As I said, communities have their own ways of doing things, but they also have their own experiences from previous development. So very often you're going into an environment which has been affected by mainstream development approaches. And so you come in and people already think they know who you are. So the first step is relationship building. And this is also why I quite like the approach that I mentioned of combining a little bit of, I mean, I call it soft advocacy, but it's simply, you know, raising people's voices that otherwise might not be raised. You know, providing spaces where they can talk on their terms about the things that are important to them, and creating those spaces so that they can say those in front of government stakeholders. Very often, for example, if we're going to go practical here, in projects, we will build in stakeholder workshops where we bring in municipal, sometimes national as well, but very often municipal government representatives, and have them hear directly from the women or the farmers or the marketplace vendors or whoever it is. And then you're building that human relationship. And I've seen, like, it sounds corny, but I've seen magic happen through that type of engagement, where again, it's human, but the first step is to just be aware that people quite understandably will be distrustful from the beginning. So your job is to build that trust, and you build that trust through recognizing that they have a set of values which is important to them, and that set of values might not be fully understood by you, but you recognize that it's important to them, and you are there to be their student to learn, and then take it from there. Change happens at the speed of trust.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. That was also a very important question. It's always a question we should continue to think about. And I thank all of you for coming to this wonderful presentation by Deb. And the SA continues to stimulate such insightful ideas, and we will try to bring more conversations in the future. And please keep in touch with us, work with us, and thank you, Deb, again for this fantastic presentation. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.